Welcome to Research Digest, where we take the knowledge of academia and make it accessible for everyone. I'm your host for this episode, Jesse Rogers, and I will be talking today about policy uncertainty and corporate investment. This is a paper by Huseyin Gulin from Purdue University and Mihai from the University of Arizona. It was published by the Oxford University Press on behalf of the Society for Financial Studies and actually won the Editor's Choice Award, so congratulations to the authors for that. And this conversation centers around, does policy-related uncertainty have important economic consequences? And you might be tempted to say, yes, of course it does. You know, uncertainty, that's not when people are most willing to part with their money, right? Why would it be different for corporations and policy uncertainty? But we really want to delve in and be able to say that yes, it does, and if so, by how much, and are there any circumstances which amplify or decrease that effect, and all that kind of stuff. So let's delve into it. First, we'll need to be able to measure uncertainty and policy uncertainty. And there is an index created by Baker, Bloom, and Davis, hereafter referred to as BBD, which does just that. They took three measures and made an index out of it. The first is newspapers. They have a software which would run an algorithm to see how often newspapers are using words like uncertainty, policy, Congress, and all those things together. And the reason why that index works is because we had to do a human audit of this in order to know that it works. And what we find is that only 1.8% of the time are newspapers reporting about a reduction in uncertainty, right? They're always talking about an increase in uncertainty. So forget about left-right bias. What the media really has is a tremendous bias in favor of negativity. So when things are going bad, they are quick to tell you about it, but they don't really tell you very much about it when it's going well. So they hardly ever report a decrease in uncertainty. So whenever you see those words, 98.2% of the time, that's what's going on, is that it's an increase in uncertainty. So we can track that, and coupled with the Congressional Budget Office expiring tax codes, and also if forecasters are disagreeing in which direction fiscal and monetary policy is going, if there's a wide disagreement, that was the last component of the index. And so what we see, it does track, when we have wars, when we have elections, that's when you see the most policy uncertainty. So this does a pretty good job of measuring that. Don't run! Relax. Hang on. This formula, I know it looks scary, but this is what that data feeds into. Okay? So policy uncertainty, PU, that's the variable right there. And we've also, this is really just as complicated as it looks, just a variation of what you already have seen from basic algebra with slope. We have a dependent variable equaling a constant times an independent variable plus a constant. This is the slope-intercept form. Hopefully you've seen this. Well, if we take that same idea and we have a dependent variable and a lot of independent variables, each with their own coefficients and a bunch of constants, then that's basically what all this is. It's just multiplication and addition done over and over again with terms that very few people in the world understand. But here's a key. And so CapEx, that means capital investment. TA, that would be total assets. And you have, if you want to go through, you can pause this and try to make sense of this formula, or we can just keep going. But I want you to have at least a chance of making sense of this, even if you don't have a math background. Same thing with how beta and delta are determined. You kind of have to have a background in statistics to make sense of this one, so I might make a separate video, but I don't want to get lost in the weeds here. But if this is something important to you, this is how they determine those. So there were a lot of concerns that the authors wanted to make sure that they addressed. And the first that we'll talk about is which aspect of the BBD really drives results. And it turns out news-based is the best way to go, because it picks up expiring tax code and forecaster disagreement. This is something that news agencies will report on. So it picks that up, and turns out to just be a simpler way of managing the results. So from here on out, that's what they do, is they just simplify BBD. Instead of being a comprehensive index of these 3 variables, they just track the news-based part. The next thing to consider was, what if policy uncertainty is actually counter-cyclical? So in other words, what if what we're seeing when we're measuring policy uncertainty is really just a lack of possible investments? So there's just, in a downturn, there's not as many good investments. So to compensate for that, what they do is they use the year-ahead forecasts of GDP growth and consumer confidence. This is the first thing that popped into my mind when I looked at this study, is how do you know you're measuring policy uncertainty and not just general economic uncertainty? And they knew this would be a big deal, I guess, because they went all out. They used 5 proxies for this one, so that it's not just general economic uncertainty that they're picking up, but it's really policy uncertainty. Next thing to consider, can policy uncertainty be used to reliably predict investments out of sample? So what we mean by in sample and out of sample is you can come up with a model that is too good of a fit for your data, and it just fits your sample data so perfectly that it's tracking a lot of noise that isn't really important, but it fits to that particular data set in just a fantastic way, right? But when you take it out of sample and you have it measure other data, it can't predict as well as it needs to. So there's a lot of literature about how to overcome this, and they go through the methodology of Clark and West, who I've depicted here very crudely. You can tell what movies I'm looking forward to seeing, right? But for those of you who have a short attention span, don't click over to any trailers, because we are almost done. Hang with me, it's about to get really interesting. So here we go. Cross-sectional heterogeneity. What they're talking about there is not every firm is the same, right? Different firms experience different situations. So one of the hetero meaning different, one of the different things that we're going to see from firm to firm is their investment irreversibility. So in other words, when they jump out of the plane on this thing, how easy is it to click the undo button? For some firms, once they commit, that's it. They can't go back, right? So spoiler alert, this does turn out to be a very big deal. And so for corporations where they can't reallocate their assets very easily, they're deeply affected by policy uncertainty. Also, dependence on government spending. So for example, if you're SpaceX, you're going to be a lot more affected if NASA gets its budget slashed than Walmart might be, right? So different firms experience different sorts of situations with and dependence on government spending. This is another really big deal. There could be more of these cross-sectional heterogeneity issues, and the authors admit that, but these are the 2 that they definitely talk about. We have a question about prolonged uncertainty. What happens, it's understandable that firms might want to postpone their investment, but eventually you don't want to do that for too long, because what happens when it just becomes so costly to put it off that whether you're uncertain or not, you just have to invest. And then there's the other thing about sorry, what about pent-up demand? So what happens when when we do start to see investment? Is there such an upswing as they're riding this roller coaster of uncertainty? Is there such an upswing that it makes up for the lack of investment? And there is to some degree, but you don't bounce quite as high. Another issue that they needed to resolve was endogeneity. So if you want to imagine endogeneity as being sort of like having a microphone too close to the speakers, that feedback sound that you get when you have that feedback loop. And this is a little bit like the numerical or statistical issue of having variables that are interdependent, sort of creating a real problem for you. And one way of overcoming that was to use Canada, because they have basically the same economy that the United States does, but their government is different. So they're not going to have the same, it's easier to isolate policy uncertainty. And of course, another issue is political polarization. That creates uncertainty, right? So you can create a variable for how much of that is going on. And, here I couldn't resist depicting our political leaders in the light that I see them in terms of their maturity and ability to resolve problems. Anyway, don't want to get stuck in those weeds. Let's go to the takeaways of this. What we see is a persistent negative relationship between policy uncertainty and investment. And that's especially true, as we talked about, when there's irreversible investment or if they're dependent on government contracts. There's a doubling in the level of policy, policy uncertainty is associated with an 8.7% drop in quarterly investment rates. So, that's pretty big. This is quarterly investment rate we're talking about, which means that cumulatively, over the course of several quarters, what we're going to see, for example, in 2007 to 2009, there was a 32% fall in capital investments, right? Well, 1/3 of that, they calculate, is due to policy uncertainties. This is a pretty big effect. And so this is something for policymakers to think about, that this indecision, in some ways, it could be just as bad as making the wrong decisions. So if you're getting your policy wrong, yeah, that's bad, but dragging your feet on it, that's bad too. And these indecision effects are long-lasting. It can be up to 2 years. So definitely something for our policymakers to consider and for you to be aware of. So this has been a Research Digest. Let me get some music. This has been Research Digest. I'm your host, Jesse Rogers. Thank you for listening. If you liked our video, please click like. And if you want to see more, we have more upcoming, so click subscribe and keep researching. Thank you.